So how do we honor someone? There are many ways, really, that we can honor someone. You may tell them how much you appreciate them. You may tell others how much you appreciate that person and how great they are. You may write it in a book. You may make a movie about them. You may write poems about them. You might put on a banquet, throw a party in their honor. You may give gifts. You may defer to that person in order to and show respect to that person. You might do something to help them or to serve them. And you can even show honor by simply following someone's advice or doing what they've told you to do. These are all ways that we can honor someone, and this is what we see in these chapters that we're going to look at today in 1Kings. God is being honored. Now, as we read this, you might say, wait a minute, this is telling us about Solomon. And that's true, but it's telling us about how Solomon is honoring God. And I've broken this long passage into three general categories: serving, worship, and dedication to honor God. So we'll be beginning in chapter 5. And chapter 5 tells us that how Solomon got all the wood and stone materials to build the temple for God. But it starts with an agreement. So look at chapter 5, verse 1. It says, "Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram always loved David. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, 'You know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. And so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord said to David my father, your son, whom I will set on your throne in your place, shall build the house for my name. Now therefore, command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you set. For you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians." And so here we're introduced to Hiram. And Hiram is the king of Tyre, and we are told that Hiram always loved David. In other words, they had a good relationship. They got along. They were on friendly terms, or maybe they had even a real friendship. But the main point of that statement is that they had an alliance together. They had an alliance that benefit both Israel and Tyre. You see, Tyre controlled all the trade by sea, by water. And Israel controlled all the trade by land. And so in that region, together, the two of them controlled all of the trade in the region that was passing through. And so they had this alliance. And earlier, we know that Hiram had provided materials for David when he built his own palace. And so they worked well together. And so when Hiram hears that Solomon has replaced David as king in Israel, he sends a message. He sends this delegation to him in order to congratulate Solomon on becoming king, and he offers to continue that alliance. Well, Solomon takes him up on that offer, and he immediately asks to work out a deal so that wood could be purchased and secured skilled workers to help build the temple. And it's interesting, Solomon uses the words, "you know." In other words, there's something that Hiram already knew. Hiram already knew about David's desire to build a temple for God. And he also knew what God had said to David about not building it, and that Solomon would build it. See, David had probably already talked to Hiram about it, probably already discussed buying materials from him, and most likely he had talked to Solomon too and say, hey, this is where you should get your wood. And so Solomon offers then to pay whatever price Hiram sets. He basically tells him to name his price. What will it cost? But I want you to notice something. When Solomon is talking about this alliance and this business deal, he honors God. He talks about God. Now, how does he do that? He gives God credit for giving Israel peace. And he tells Hiram why he needs this wood, because he's building a temple for God and to honor God. Which raises a question for me. When we have the opportunity to honor God in conversation, do we? You see, Solomon could have simply said, okay, I need some wood, and things are going well for us here. But he doesn't. He says things are going well. Why? Because of God. And I need some wood. Why? Because I'm building a temple to honor my God. And so he brings God into that conversation. And so if someone asks you, so what are you doing on Sunday? You could simply say, well, I'm going to hang out with my family. Well, that may be true, but is that really what you're doing Sunday morning? Well, we're hanging out with our family, honoring God. We're going to church. And you could even add, want to come with? When we have the opportunity to honor God in our conversations, do we take that opportunity? Well, back to our passage. We have a long passage today, and I don't have time to read all of it, so you can go home and read it later. But I am going to summarize some parts of it. I'm going to read some parts, and I'm going to summarize some parts for you. So in the rest of chapter 5, Hiram is happy with Solomon for that continued friendly relationship, for that alliance, and he wants to do the trade that Solomon has asked for. And so Hiram says that he will cut the trees and he will send the lumber by sea to any port that Solomon chooses. And there's this cool detail. He says that they'll take the trees and they're going to strap them together like rafts and send them through the water. And then when they get to the port, they'll cut them apart. And then Solomon's people can take the wood across the land. And so in exchange, Solomon then will provide a wheat and oil for Hiram, for his household, for his court, for the year. And Solomon does this each year that they are doing this work. And then look at verse 12. Chapter 5, verse 12. It says, "And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, as he promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty." Now, why was there good relationship? Why was there peace between Solomon and Hiram? Because God gave Solomon wisdom. Again, we see here that God is being honored here. God is the one that gave him the wisdom. And God is keeping his promise to Solomon. Well, then we're told that Solomon conscripted 30,000 workers from Israel. And he broke them into 3 groups of 10,000. And so 10,000 people would work each month, and they rotated. That meant that these men who had been conscripted into work on the temple, into getting the timbers, were gone 4 weeks working, and then for 4 months out of the year, and then they would be home for 8 months out of the year, so they could take care of their own crops and their own personal needs during those 8 months. But we're also told that there were thousands of stone cutters. As you can imagine, a big building, big stones. There were thousands of stone cutters and laborers to transport that stone. And then there were managers who had to manage all of those workers as well. This was a huge operation, and it took great organization in order to pull it off. It's a good thing Solomon was wise. And so God gave him the ability to pull this project off. Look at chapter 6, verse 1. It says, "In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord." And so we're told here that Solomon started building the house, or the temple, in his 4th year as king. So it took some time to gather materials, and now he's actually starting the building. And it says, but there's another date that's given here in this verse that's even more significant. We're told that it was 480 years after the Exodus. Now, why would they mention the Exodus here? What is so significant about it here? Well, there's a few things. First of all, both the Exodus and building of the temple were great national events for Israel. These were huge things. You see, in the Exodus, God had demonstrated his awesome power, and he had delivered the people of Israel from Egypt. And now they are building a temple to worship that awesome God who had delivered them. Also, the Exodus related to God's promise, his promise to give the people of Israel this land and to establish them in it. Now, that promise has been fulfilled. They have been given the land, they have been given rest, they are established in the land, and they are building the temple. Which, by the way, Moses had foretold following the Exodus, that they would have a central place of worship. And so God has kept his promise, and God is deserving of worship, so they build this temple to worship him and to honor him. And then, like the Exodus, having a permanent temple for God in the promised land is the beginning of a new era for Israel. They left Egypt, new era. They have a temple, new era, new way of relating to God through the temple. And so Solomon starts the building. And we're given here in the chapters a few details about the layout and design of the temple. And it's really the same basic layout as the tabernacle, but about twice the size. And so that means it was the one main building that was divided into two rooms. The first room larger and the smaller back room. And the two rooms are the holy place and the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. And then Solomon built on a large porch in front of it. And then we're told that he has 3 stories of rooms that were built onto the outside walls of the other 3 sides of the temple, where things could be stored. Or we actually don't know exactly what he did with those rooms, or all of them anyways, but there are 3 stories of rooms around the outside wall of the temple. The walls were all stone, and the ceiling was made of wood. So at this point, the outside structure is finished, and the description of the temple is interrupted. Look at verse 11, chapter 6, verse 11. It says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, concerning this house that you are building. If you walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel." So Solomon built the house and finished it. So God comes and talks to Solomon, and he encourages Solomon. And in doing so, he confirms his promise, and he tells him that he will be present with Israel in a special way through the temple. But when he makes this promise and encourages Solomon, he also reminds him. He reminds Solomon that there's a condition. And it's conditioned on his faithfulness to God. So God says, I will do this, but you need to walk in my ways. You need to be obedient and faithful. And this makes an important point, because we're talking about the building of this temple, this magnificent temple for God. But true devotion to God can't be expressed by a building alone. Even if it's a magnificent building, there's got to be more. True devotion to God can't be expressed by ritual alone. You see, what's most important is your heart for God, your obedience to God, your faithfulness to God. So think about what that means. That means that if you're serving God, you could even do great things for God and not really honor him. You could be serving him in a great way and not really be honoring him. If your heart's not right, if you're not being obedient, if you're not truly being faithful to God. So the question then is your heart right? Are you truly honoring God? Well, the work on the temple continues now with the interior. And the interior of the temple is very ornate and it's very costly because it represents the greatness of God and the value of God. We're told that the floors were made of wood, some from cypress trees or some other evergreen tree. The walls were lined with cedar planks. So it was built with these stone walls, but those stone walls were lined with cedar planks from floor to ceiling. And so there was no stone visible on the inside of the temple. And there was a cedar wall that was built between the two rooms of the temple, the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And all of that wood that was on the walls had carvings on them, covered in carvings of gourds and flowers and cherubim and palm trees. And then all of that carved wood is covered in gold. And in the Holy of Holies, the place where the ark would be kept, the ark which symbolized the presence of God, there were two large cherubim, angels, that were carved out of olive wood and covered in gold. Now, when I say large, I mean large. They were tall and their wings were spread out and they stood side by side. So with the tip of one angel's wings touched the tip of the other angel's wings. And they spread across the entire wall. So about 30 feet wide. So these two large angels standing there in the Holy of Holies. It was as if they were guarding the presence of God. And it represented the awesomeness of God. Because you don't just run into God's presence. You don't approach him flippantly. You don't take him lightly. But you treat him as holy. We're also told that there were some wooden doors that were carved and covered with gold for the entrance to the temple and in between the rooms. 2 Chronicles tells us that there was a curtain between the rooms. It doesn't mention the doors. They probably had both. But we're also told here that there were some gold chains hung across the inner door. And I think that was to symbolize, again, that you don't just rush in, that it's not anyone has access. It's not easy access to the presence of God, to a holy God. And then there was an altar made of cedar and overlaid in gold that was right outside the Holy of Holies. And then catch this. Even the floorboards were covered in gold. How many of you walk on gold? Well, we're told in the heaven the streets are made of gold. But even the floors were covered in gold. Solomon was extravagant in making this temple for God. And he was extravagant because he was trying to honor God, to show his great worth, to express God's glory as best he could. And we might say, hey, it fell short a little, maybe a lot. But he was expressing God's glory as best he could. And it took him 4 years to complete it. Now, look at verse 1 of chapter 7. In chapter 7, verse 1, it says, Solomon was building his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house. And then it goes on to give some details about that. And you may say, wait a minute, 4 years to build a temple, 13 years to build his own house. What's going on there? But the thing is It was really a palace complex. It was more than one building. It was several buildings. There were houses, plural. There was the throne room where they would make judgments. And so it was a big project. But there's only one thing I want to point out about this, is if you look at the beginning of chapter 7, that first paragraph, that is all about Solomon's house, Solomon's palace complex. And the only point I want to make is how little space is given to telling us about Solomon's palace. We are told hardly anything, very small, very few details. One paragraph in the middle of 3 chapters about the description of the temple. So which is more important? The temple. All right? God is the focus of these chapters, not Solomon. Look at verse 13, chapter 7, verse 13. It says, and King Solomon sent and brought Hiram from Tyre, and he was the son of a widow of the tribe of Naphtali, and his father was a man of Tyre, a worker in bronze. And he was full of wisdom, understanding, and skill for making any work in bronze. He came to King Solomon and did all his work. Now here we're told about a guy named Hiram. This is a different Hiram than the king who we were talking about earlier. This is a craftsman, and he is half Israelite. And Solomon brings him in to work on the temple. And this chapter then goes on to describe what he made for the temple. And it's summarized for us in verses 40 to 47. Let's look at that. So chapter 7, verse 40. It says, Hiram also made pots and shovels and basins. So Hiram finished all the work that he did for King Solomon on the house of the Lord. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars, and the 2 lattice works to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the tops of the pillars. And the 400 pomegranates for the 2 lattice works, 2 rows of pomegranates for each lattice work, to cover the 2 bowls of the capitals that were on the pillars. The 10 stands and the 10 basins on the stands, and the 1 sea and the 12 oxen underneath the sea. All of these verses that I've not read to you sound a lot like that. A whole lot of details. Continue, verse 45. Now the pots and the shovels and the basins, all these vessels in the house of the Lord, which Hiram made for King Solomon, were of burnished bronze. In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. And Solomon left all the vessels unweighed, because there were so many of them, the weight of the bronze was not ascertained. So he made all of this stuff, and it was all made out of bronze. He made shovels and bowls that were used for the ashes from the sacrifices. He made 2 pillars. Now these pillars were almost 30 feet tall. And they were made out of bronze, and they had decorative tops that were made to set on them. And then there was fancy stuff that stretched between the 2 pillars. And then he made this bronze sea, it's called. It was used for the ceremonial cleansing before approaching God, before the priest would approach God. It was like a giant decorative bowl that was about 15 feet across and about 7.5 feet high. So this is a big bowl. And we're told that it was cast in one piece. You know what that means? That means this took skill. That's not an easy thing to do. He also made the stand for that sea, that giant bowl, that was made of 12 oxen or 12 bulls that were with 3 of them facing in each direction, and the sea was set on their backs. And then he made 10 ornate stands that were about 6 feet by 6 feet and about 4.5 feet tall, that had wheels on them. And then there were big bowls that were 6 feet wide on tops of those stands that were filled with water, also used in cleansings, rituals. But here's something interesting. They named the 2 bronze pillars, those big bronze pillars, they named them Jachin and Boaz. Then those names mean he will establish and in him is strength. And so those pillars with those names were reminders when the people came to the temple. They were reminders that God is in control, that he is the one who establishes, and he is the one who gives strength. So when the Israelites came to worship God at the temple, and when they came to seek forgiveness from God, and when they came to seek help from God, they were reminded of these truths. They were reminded that God is the source of all good things, and we need him. And that brings us to the second way that we honor God, and that is worship. And first of all, I just want to say, I want to make that point that when we come to worship God, we need to remember the greatness of God. We might not have two giant pillars to say, hey, remember this. But when we come to worship, we need to remember the greatness of God and the goodness of God and our need for him. Well, let's keep reading in chapter 7, verse 48. So Solomon made all the vessels that were in the house of the Lord, the golden altar, the golden table for the bread of the presence, the lampstand of pure gold, 5 on the south side and 5 on the north before the inner sanctuary, the flowers, the lamps, the tongs of gold, the cups, snuffers, basins, dishes for incense, and fire pans of pure gold, and the sockets of gold for the doors of the innermost part of the house, the most holy place, and for the doors of the nave of the temple. Thus all the work that King Solomon did on the house of the Lord was finished. And Solomon brought the things that David his father had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the vessels, and stored them in the treasuries of the house of the Lord. And so everything is done and everything's ready. We've had 3 chapters of details about the temple. But the author isn't just telling us all these details to give us a bunch of tedious facts. And he's not giving us a complete plan like blueprints either. You couldn't read through this and perfectly recreate it. That's not his point. What the author is doing is he is enthusiastically describing the marvelous work done to make a beautiful and awe-inspiring temple that was made to honor God, who is even more beautiful and awe-inspiring. Now, the thing nowadays, a lot of times people will read a passage like this or see a passage like this and maybe even skip over it. But they will see a passage like this and they just think of it as tedious and boring. Just a bunch of facts, a bunch of details. But the goal of the author is for us to be taken in by the magnificence of this temple. This temple, it's a reflection of God's glory. Of course, again, a limited reflection, but he describes this for us in order to glorify God, to say, look how great God is. Now, apply this thinking to your own worship. How do you come to God in worship? Do you come with a sense of awe? Do you come with the goal of glorifying God? Or are you just casually going through the motions? Oh, this is just what we do. Or maybe do you find the singing or the praying or the teaching tedious? Or do you recognize the magnificence of the one we are coming to worship? And humbly and joyfully come with an open heart and enthusiastically bring him glory. That's worship. Chapter 8, verse 1. Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes of the leaders of the fathers' houses of the people of Israel before King Solomon in Jerusalem, to bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. And all the men of Israel assembled to King Solomon at the feast in the month of Ethanim, which is the 7th month. And all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord, the tent of the meeting, and all the holy vessels that were in the tent. The priests and the Levites brought them up. And King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who had assembled before him were with him before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and oxen that they could not be counted or numbered. That was a lot. Then the priest brought the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place in the inner sanctuary of the house, in the most holy place, underneath the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread out their wings over the place of the ark, so that the cherubim overshadowed the ark and its poles. And the poles were so long that the ends of the poles were seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen from outside. And they are there to this day. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb, where that's the 10 Commandments, where the Lord made a covenant with the people of Israel when they came out of the land of Egypt. And when the priests came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. Now this is a big moment for Israel. All of the leaders are coming together, and they're coming together to dedicate this temple to God. And Solomon chose a specific time to do it. The interesting thing is, it's almost a year later after the temple was finished. Why would he wait so long? He waited for the time of the Feast of Booths. Now, the Feast of Booths was when the people of Israel would come out and they would camp in tents. They would camp in tents as a reminder of the 40 years in the wilderness. It was a reminder of God's provision. And it was a reminder that time of wandering came to an end when God gave them the land and gave them rest. And so, the other thing is just before the people of Israel entered the land, the second generation that came out of Egypt, just before they entered the land, Moses told them of a central place of worship, that there would be this place of worship where they would come and they would celebrate and worship God. And he celebrated the Feast of Booths with them. Now they are in the land. Now they have rest. And now they are dedicating that place of worship that Moses spoke of, where God will be in their midst as he promised. And so they do it at the time of booths, when they're already remembering these things about God. Again, the focus is on God. And we're told here the priests bring the ark and they place it in the temple, and when they come out, a cloud comes and fills the temple. Now, remember the cloud that led the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt and throughout their time of wandering. Do you remember the cloud and the fire and the thunder that was on top of Mount Sinai when God met with Moses and gave him the 10 Commandments, gave him the law? Do you remember the cloud that filled the tabernacle when it was dedicated? This cloud, this is the visible representation of God's presence. And our author here calls it the glory of the Lord. So the visible representation of the glory of the Lord, of God's presence. God is coming to dwell among his people as he promised. God saying, I'm here with you. Of course, this reminds me of a similar incident that happened many years later. In Acts chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, it says, when the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place, and suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting, and dividing tongues as of fire appeared to them and rested on each one, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit. Now this was not a cloud. It was a wind and fire, but it symbolized the presence of the Holy Spirit. God coming to his people through the Holy Spirit. And since that day, God has been with us in a unique way through the Holy Spirit. And then there's one other thing. I just got to keep going. So then there's something we're looking forward to. A promise that is found in Revelation 21. John writes this, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth." He's talking about our eternal home. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem," that's the city of God, "coming down out of heaven from God." And he says, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away.'" Not a symbol, God with his people. This is our hope. This is what we know will happen. This is what we look forward to. When everything will be good, everything will be right, and it will be because God will be dwelling among his people. Back to the passage. And now we see that God is honored through dedication. When Solomon sees that cloud, he remembers the cloud on Mount Sinai. Well, he remembers reading about the cloud on Mount Sinai. This same God that was there on Mount Sinai, this same God has filled the temple and has made it holy, set it apart. And Solomon blesses the people by praising God because God has kept his promises and to them, and he's done great things, and now he's allowed for a permanent place for the ark. And he goes on and he retells things that we already know, things that we've heard over and over about David and the promises, things that Israel already knows, but he retells it to highlight God's grace and God's mercy. You see, they are celebrating God and all he has done. And now he will lead the people in prayer. And we're going to read his prayer, or most of it. And this prayer is full of awe and gratitude. He publicly pours out his heart to God, and he praises him for what he has done and what he will do. And he has complete confidence in God's promises and God's grace, but he also recognizes his own responsibility to be faithful to God. And these words are filled with emotion and conviction and devotion. Look at chapter 8, verse 22. "Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in the presence of all the assembly of Israel, and spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, 'O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing steadfast love to your servants who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept with your servant David my father what you declared to him. You spoke with your mouth, and with your hand have fulfilled it this day. Now therefore, O Lord God of Israel, keep for your servant David my father what you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel. If only your sons pay close attention to their way to walk before me as you have walked before me. Now therefore, O God of Israel, let your word be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant David my father. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea, O Lord my God. Listen to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eye may be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers towards this place. And listen to the plea of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray towards this place, and listen in heaven, your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. If a man sins against his neighbor and is made to take an oath and comes and swears his oath before your altar in this house, then hear in heaven and act and judge your servants, condemning the guilty by bringing his conduct on his own head, and vindicating the righteous by rewarding him according to his righteousness. When your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they turn again to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them again to the land that you gave to their fathers. When heaven is shut up and there is no rain because they have sinned against you, if they pray towards this place and acknowledge your name and turn from their sin when you afflict them, then hear in heaven and forgive their sin of your servants, your people of Israel, when you teach them the good way in which they should walk, and grant rain upon your land, which they have given to your people as an inheritance. If there is famine in the land, if there is pestilence or blight or mildew or locust or caterpillar, if their enemy besieges them in the land at their gates, whatever plague, whatever sickness there is, whatever prayer, whatever plea is made by any man or by all your people Israel, each knowing the affliction of his own heart and stretching out his hands toward this house, then hear in heaven your dwelling place and forgive and act and render to each whose heart you know, according to all his ways, for you only know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, and for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand and of your outstretched arm, when he comes and prays toward this house, hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the people of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your people Israel, that they may know that this house that I have built is called by your name. And he continues on with some other sin situations and says, and when they repent, please hear their prayers. But I want to pull out just a couple key points here. Early on, Solomon said, there is no God like you. And he declares the uniqueness of God, that he is the only true God, that he makes promises to his people and he keeps them. And based on the previously kept promises, he has confidence to ask God to continue keeping those promises. And then secondly, there's this phrase in the middle where he talks about this house. And he says, this house, it can't contain God. He says, in fact, there's nothing in heaven and earth. You can't contain him. He's bigger than all of it. And even though this house may be magnificent, that can't hold God. And it's this parenthetical comment that kind of breaks the flow as Solomon thinks about how amazing it is that God would choose to dwell in a house made by man. And he's thinking about this, how God has provided this point of connection between God and his people. He has provided a means for forgiveness of sins and maintaining fellowship with God. And that he's thinking about how that when they pray at that temple, that God will hear them from heaven. And God has made a way for people to approach him. Although he is far greater than they are, he will listen to their prayers, listening to the prayers of his people. He's thinking about how God has condescended to his people. In other words, he's come and he's met them where they're at to be with them and to help them. Doesn't that sound like Jesus? That's what Jesus did. God became a man to meet us where we were. He came to us even though we were sinners. And he went to the cross and died on the cross and rose again to pay the price for our sin. He came to us and met us where we were, and he provided a way for us to be forgiven, provided for a way for us to relate to God, provided a way that we could have a relationship with him. Everyone who believes in Jesus is forgiven of their sins, is made a child of God, and has access to the Father through Jesus. That's good news. Well, 2 Chronicles says, it tells us what happened when Solomon finished praying. It says, as soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the priest could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement and worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. Now that is confirmation. He prays, and fire comes down from heaven and consumes the sacrifices. There is no doubt that God heard his prayer and will do what he has promised. Well, then Solomon blesses the people, and there's a challenge in his blessing. I just want to read that for you. Chapter 8, verse 55. It says, and he stood and blessed all the assembly of Israel with a loud voice, saying, blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel, according to all that he promised. Not one word has failed of all his good promise, which he spoke by Moses his servant. The Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. May he not leave us or forsake us, that he may incline our hearts to him, to walk in all his ways, and to keep his commandments, his statutes, and his rules, which he commanded our fathers. Let these words of mine with which I have pleaded before the Lord be near the Lord our God day and night, and may he maintain the cause of his servant and the cause of his people Israel as each day requires, that all the people of the earth may know that the Lord is God, there is no other. Let your heart therefore be wholly true to the Lord our God, walking in his statutes and keeping his commandments as at this day. Here in his blessing of the people, he makes these 2 points. 2 points. One, God is always faithful. And secondly, that his people have the responsibility to be faithful to God. And this is interesting. He gives 2 reasons why he always wants God to be with his people. He says, be with us that, here are prayers that. His 2 reasons. First is so that they can be devoted and obedient to God. You might expect it to be so that things will be good for us. But he says, be with us so that we might be devoted to you, so that we might be obedient to you, that we might walk in your ways. In other words, help us to follow you. And the second thing is so that other people throughout the world will come to know the one true God. See, when God does bless them, they will see his power and they will want to know him as well. And that leads to one final thought. That God's people need to give their hearts completely to God, to be fully devoted to him, and to continue to obey him and live for him. And the chapter ends as they offer thousands of sacrifices and dedicate the temple. Part of those sacrifices were burned on the altar. Part of them were eaten by the people as they worshiped and celebrated the feast before God, as they fellowshiped with God, celebrating in the worship of God. And then they went home happy, thankful for God's blessing. So let's talk about their dedication. Where did it come from? Why did they have it? What's the point? And our dedication. Why be dedicated to God? Well, we're dedicated to God because of his grace and faithfulness. We're dedicated to God because he is the one true God. We're dedicated to God because he made a way for us to have a relationship with him and to fellowship with him. We are dedicated to God because he hears our prayers. And our dedication comes from the heart. And it is displayed in obedience. And our dedication to God drives us to worship him. And it brings joy. To put it simply, we do all that we do for the glory of God. We serve to honor God. We worship to honor God. We live dedicated lives to honor God. It's all about God, His glory, and His honor.